wish. Or you can send it in via snail mail, or maybe if you want to come to our outing tomorrow, you can pay in person. Anyway, we like your money, so bring it on. And that tomorrow, no, not tomorrow, sorry, on Sunday, we're at 10 a.m. at the Birch Street parking at Collingwood Harbor. We're having a club outing there. So the weather isn't looking as good as it had when we planned the meeting, so try to dress accordingly. They're calling for periods of snow with the freezing rain and thaw and freeze and thaw and freeze. Trails might be icy. You may want to wear some ice cleats or some other means of not falling on your butt. A little bit of an update about the Bluebird Trail Initiative. I think we're well underway. We've got lots of bluebird houses at the Tiny Marsh already. I know people still are making them. I'd hope that if you are making them, you'd be able to hang on to them. The plan is to install these in late March. Hopefully the ground will be soft enough by then that we can drive these posts in. We've already made arrangements to acquire the posts. Going to have them delivered at some point before March to Tiny Marsh, and Kate has promised to try and wrangle a few of the high school students from the Elmvale High School to do some of the heavy lifting for us. So hopefully that works out. I see Kate is here. I was going to do a little MTM update, but seeing as Kate's our MTM conservation rep, I wonder if Kate wouldn't mind doing a little bit of an update about what's been going on with MTM. You up for that, Kate?
Yes. I've unmuted myself, I think. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm kind of.
I'm just trying to find you on the list here. Are you?
Kate under K.
Is this list not alphabetical? Let me see if I can find you and I'll spotlight you. Hang on. There you are. Okay. There you go.
Okay, thanks. I wasn't quite ready for this. Bob, did you have anything, I can talk about a couple of things, but did you have anything particular in mind that should be mentioned?
Sorry, Kate, I didn't mean to ambush you. I thought you might have something ready. I only have a couple of things that I wanted to talk about. One was the fact that the MTM is planning to go ahead with a waterfowl viewing day. And we're looking not only for people to come out to it, but it's going to be on April the 15th. And we're looking for some of perhaps club members who are knowledgeable of birds who might be willing to be guides. I volunteered. Don't know that Ken can make it. We were talking before the meeting, and Ken may have a conflict, but possible we can get him out there for one of the morning sessions. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that, and the other news that I wanted to talk about, the Conservation Association has selected a capital project. We don't have a lot of money, but they intend to replace one of those viewing stands out on the dike that got torn down rather unceremoniously. So that's a bit of positive news. Other than that, I don't have a heck of a lot that I want to say. Anything you want to add, maybe about your Phragmites project or?
Well, I'll just add something about the viewing day, and that is that we're going to be featuring a wildlife artist, Wayne Simkin, who's a member of our board, and I had no idea, but he's a very accomplished wood carver. He does birds, and he's won a couple of championships for his work. So we'll be putting out some information about him on flyers and on the MTM website. So watch out for that. And then with luck, we'll have a good turnout of birds. It's all dependent on the weather. If we've guessed on the right day, hopefully we have. Phragmites, nothing much going on at the moment, but some of our members are upgrading their skills. Some of our volunteers are attending workshops, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council, and next week there's the Ontario Phragmites Working Group, and these are useful for us because they put us in touch with other people who are battling invasive species, and we find out what's going on and what the latest research shows, and get to discuss matters with other people who have these problems. So I think that's about it.
Okay, thank you, Kate. As I said, sorry, I didn't mean to ambush you. I thought you might have. You're usually reliable. Anyway, that's about all the club business we have, and I know you're anxious to hear our speaker, so I'm going to turn it over to Ken, and he can introduce Patrick. Go ahead, Ken. Ken, will you introduce our speaker?
I'm here. I'm just pressing buttons. Just a second.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, our speaker, Patrick Monahan. Patrick Moldowan. Get that right. Patrick Moldowan, and I've been looking forward to this presentation for 3 years now. Patrick was originally scheduled to give this presentation back in, I think, of April of 2020, but we all know what happened. And I tried to get him in the years in between to do one of our Zoom meetings that we had, but Patrick spends a lot of his time out in boggy, marshy environments where there's very little Wi-Fi. But we managed to pin him down for this meeting in January, where I guess most of the bogs and marshes and fens are a little bit frozen. And he was able to join us to give us this talk on Mauritius. So I find most of our guests do a better job of introducing themselves than I ever do. So I'm not going to go on too much to tell you about him, but he's becoming rather famous. You'll see his name a lot. He's found this thing that people didn't know, that some of the carnivorous plants in Algonquin are actually eating salamanders. And there's a terrific photo that I think won some prizes this year that you can probably find on the internet of a pitcher plant, and it's a macroscopic photo, a pitcher plant that actually is eating 2 salamanders, and a beautiful, somewhat gory photo. But anyway, Patrick was raised in St. Catharines, where my wife and I spent a lot of time. And as a young fellow, he became, well, like most young kids, he was fascinated with dinosaurs. But as he got older, he found out that he really didn't want to spend his life with extinct animals. He wanted to work with real, live, living animals. And he figured that the closest thing to dinosaurs he could find were the turtles and all the herps. So that's where he concentrated his efforts, and he's become quite an expert. He did the wildlife biology program at the University of Guelph, and he eventually started working summers at Algonquin Park, which is where he found his bliss. And bliss stands for Bat Lake Inventory of Spotted Salamanders. And say Patrick has rode his research on salamanders to quite a bit of fame. But today he's going to talk to us Mauritius, and I think it was back in 2015 that Patrick was selected to be a new NOAA, which is a project of the Wildlife Preservation Canada. And you don't have to, I guess you don't actually have to change your name to NOAA, but NOAA was, he was the guy back that, he had an order from God to protect the biodiversity of this planet. It was written in stone in the Bible. And the new NOAA project carries that on, and Patrick is carrying that on in Algonquin. And tonight he's going to tell us all about it. So let me do a bit more button pushing here, Patrick. I'm going to remove the spotlight from Bob, and you're sharing your screen. Let me just get a pin on Patrick.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, not only for that wonderful introduction, but as well for your persistence in finally getting me to join the Midland-Penetanguishene Field Naturalists for a lovely evening here. And I thank everybody very much for tuning in. It's lovely to join you. And on what a night too. I hope that some of the images I'll bring you today will get you a little bit warmer as we head into this snowy or rainy evening, depending where you find yourself in the province. But I think the sunbeams of Mauritius will shine on us tonight as we talk about the amazing biodiversity of this island and the challenges that it faces. So without further ado, we'll get this presentation underway. Ken was very generous with his introduction, and true to what he said. I've been a fanatic of amphibians and reptiles from a very young age, and I'm fortunate now to be a semi-professional, earning a keep working with these astounding animals in many ways, shapes, and forms. My brain has two halves naturally, and much of it is focused either on turtles or on salamanders, and so that's often what I find myself sharing most passionately, but it's lovely to spend time with you tonight to share the experience in Mauritius. This story starts in a slightly unexpected place. This is outside the Peabody Museum of Natural History in Connecticut at Yale University and their rare book stacks. The reason that the story starts here is because this is where I received an email from Wildlife Preservation Canada saying that my application for their new NOAA scholarship was under serious consideration, and that I should hop on the phone and have an interview. In fact, it was a large snowstorm that prevented me rushing back and having it in person. And so we can see just here how natural history really begins to unite us and the places it'll take you. So the story tonight really is about an astounding corner of the earth, and I wouldn't blame many of you if you didn't know where Mauritius was, but I hope by the time we leave this talk, if I've done my job, you most certainly will, and that it will be an unforgettable place. So when we look on the world map, once again, yeah, if you squint really close on this screen, you may just make it out there in the Indian Ocean. East of Madagascar lies the Mascarene Islands. The Mascarenes are collectively made up of Rodrigues and Mauritius, as well as the island of Reunion. Mauritius is officially an African republic, as is its associated island, Rodrigues, and Reunion is a French colony out there in the central Indian Ocean. What's fascinating to me is this theme of biogeography. That is where life manages and how it exists based on the geography of the landscape. Mauritius itself, as well as the Mascarene Islands at large, are really amazing because they're swept by currents coming off of Africa, but they're also swept by currents coming off of Asia. And so the assemblage of plants and animals that have come to call these islands home are really an astounding intermix of those from the continental mainlands. This here is the island of Mauritius itself. It only measures about 50 kilometers east to west and 70 kilometers north to south. And it's dotted with several dozen small islets and coral atolls around its perimeter. Despite having a small size, it has with it a really big story. And a lot of that story comes from its own natural history. And it's a bit of a turbulent human history as well. Quite amazingly, Mark Twain wrote of Mauritius that Mauritius was made first and then heaven, and heaven was copied after Mauritius. And I really think he was onto something. Given how beautiful this landscape is, the natural mountain ranges that erupt out of the ocean from its volcanic history, as well as the beautiful coral atolls that surround it. But in the years since I first heard this quote, I've been left scratching my head because, as it turns out, Mark Twain never actually visited Mauritius. So it's rather funny that he had so much to say about its beauty. So I want to formally welcome you to the island of Mauritius, situated in the central Indian Ocean. This is an island that was home to large parrots called the raven parrot that was flightless and could crack seeds as big as your fist in a single bite. This is a land of giant tortoises that roamed so densely early naturalists and sailors said that you could hop from back of one tortoise to another without touching the ground for hundreds of meters at a time. This is a land with lizards as big as your forearm and all kinds of flightless birds walking around. It's home to a pygmy owl, several species of burrowing snakes, a large flightless bird akin to an ostrich called the solitaire. And of course, being an island and one that's so remote and oceanic, it doesn't have much with respect to mammals, but it has bats. It draws inspiration from Asia by having really colorful pigeons and doves. We'll be introduced to a beautiful pink pigeon throughout the talk. And again, this theme of flightless birds arises again and again, so commonplace on islands around the world. And all kinds of geckos that span the whole spectrum of the rainbow. And perhaps its most famous resident, the dodo bird. But the dodo, like all the other species I just ran through quickly there, are no longer with us today. And this, in large part, characterizes the history of Mauritius and its future too, if not for human intervention. We're, of course, both the cause, but also the solution to a lot of the conservation problems we face, including some of these extinctions from recent history. The dodo is so emblematic of Mauritius that almost everywhere you'll go, you'll see it. From on their flag to matchboxes to corner stores, the dodo is everywhere. But it's a constant reminder of what we've lost and what we stand to lose if we continue some of our destructive practices as humans. The dodo itself, though, is also the reason for my going to Mauritius, granted several centuries removed from its extinction. But the dodo is really what was the brainchild, or the extinction of the dodo, I should say, was the brainchild behind the New NOAA program, and why, in part, conservation is so near and dear to me. I mentioned previously that Mauritius has a bit of a turbulent human history. So in the late 1500s, early mariners and sailors exploring around the globe and sourcing trade routes from Europe through Asia would eventually find the islands of the Mascarenes, Mauritius included, and they made a lot of early wood carvings and journal notes. I say turbulent as well, in part because the islands have gone through many such colonizations through time. There are no indigenous peoples per se, but originally discovered by the Dutch, later taken by the French and Portuguese. Of course, the English and French would battle over the islands time and time again. There have been lots of different colonizers, but some of these early wood engravings from the late 1500s and 1600s that survive today show us what early activities took place. You know, a lot of fishing in the lush waters of the coastal and coralline Indian Ocean islands, lots of wood harvest, especially for ships and cask building. We see some of these early illustrations here as well in the top panel, large ships docked in the bays, and the huge mountains and volcanic landscape that characterizes Mauritius. Some of those flightless birds, we can see them here being ruthlessly slaughtered for food as mariners and sailors plied the waters, taking plants and trees from the land, and those flightless birds made for pretty easy pickings. Almost quite literally depicted in one of these central right panel here is mariners harvesting a sea cow, also known as dugongs, and back then the stellar sea cow, now also an extinct species. So unfortunately, these early and turbulent times for the island of Mauritius have led to the mass loss of fauna and flora. Perhaps none suffered more than a lot of the flightless birds. For instance, this quote from a journal from 1598 translates to saying that these birds were so dumb that with a simple stocking cap and whistling, you could attract many of them at a single time. And if you carried a stick, you could of course beat them. And so they were favorite food for the sailors. Quite similarly, we see lots of other illustrations from this early time that really quite show the intentions, and fortunately not really friendly ones, of a lot of these sailors, whether it's riding on the backs of the giant tortoise, which is drawn here a bit unconventionally to look like an armadillo, but as well many of the parrots and other large flightless birds that were heavily persecuted at the time. And once again, this is an amazing contemporary illustration based on journal notes from the late 1600s, illustrating just how dense and how much of a biomass these giant tortoises had on the landscape. The fact that they were so dense that truly you could see thousands of them in a single frame of view. And once again, quite literally jump from back to back, never touching the ground. Really quite in a landscape today that is almost hard to conceive of, and maybe the closest analogs we have are the Galapagos Islands, of course, out in the central Pacific. And so this is the history of Mauritius from the late 1500s to present. This figure here shows, based on notes of journals from early sailors, the progressive loss of the native forest of Mauritius. Not surprisingly, being an island and having so many unique species, we call these endemic species, the loss of the forest and the understory plants had a big toll for things like the giant tortoises and the birds that rely on the seeds and the fruits from the trees. So by the time the early 1900s rolled around, it was estimated that only 2 to 5% of the native forest of Mauritius remained intact. And this isn't a story that's unique to Mauritius, unfortunately. It's islands around the world that are often in trouble. It's islands that tend to have really specialized communities of plants and animals, and it's because it's because of the oceans that need to be crossed that sort of act as great filters for the colonization of islands. As naturalists, you may be familiar with the concept of endemism. That is, species that are generally very localized and found nowhere else, and that is definitely true of islands. So globally, islands are home to 64% of recorded extinctions within the recent centuries. This includes extinctions of birds, reptiles, mammals, amphibians. Over 90% of extinctions of birds and reptiles, for instance, have happened on islands. And it's because on small island systems, species are so closely interlinked in their interactions that when you lose one, it's almost like setting off a row of dominoes. You often have very rapid destructions and unraveling of the food web that happens thereafter. Islands, by their very nature of being small and isolated too, are particularly vulnerable when they have invasive predators introduced or human colonization and exploitation of resources. You have a lot of issues that quickly accelerate and exacerbate an underlying problem. And this is where my life meets Mauritius. It comes courtesy this gentleman, Gerald Durrell, perhaps a favorite author and character to many of you. It was a work of Gerald Durrell and its establishment of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust on the island of Jersey in the United Kingdom that would really set this path forward, not only for improving the condition of Mauritius, but setting forth an excellent training program known today as the New NOAA Scholarship. Jerry Durrell was extremely prolific in his writings, and he really invited himself into the living room of people around the world because he made science and conservation and adventures in the outdoors accessible to people. A lot of his most popular writings from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s are probably on your bookshelves today. But Durrell was really a pioneer in conservation. Not only did he bring biodiversity into people's living rooms and engage them, but he also collected a lot of animals to start captive breeding programs. This was virtually unheard of in the 1960s and 70s, where most zoos were simply collecting animals to showcase them, and often under questionable conditions. But Jerry realized that by keeping animals and educating people about them, you could do a lot more. And you could also reintroduce their offspring into the wild and restore populations that have gone into decline. In one of his more famous works, he wrote of his conservation trust that he wanted it to become a form of a university or an educational facility where people can get training and they can take those talents that they've learned at his facilities and engage in conservation all throughout the world. He envisioned what he called, in good faith, his army, his conservation army, to strike out around the globe after having received training. And so it's from one of his books, The New Noah, from which the scholarship is named. Now, Wildlife Preservation Canada is a sister organization operating here in Canada. It's sister to the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust in the UK. That latter organization works globally. But it's Wildlife Preservation Trust in Gerald Durrell's memory, and as part of seeing a gap in conservation training in Canada, started what's called the Canada's New NOAA program. So now for 32 years, Wildlife Preservation Canada has annually fundraised to cover the travel and training expenses for a student to undertake a postgraduate diploma in endangered species recovery in collaboration with the University of Kent and the government of Mauritius. And it provides this big skills and training gap, providing human resource management skills and field experience for young people to engage with conservation projects. And Mauritius is this amazing, rich training ground, of course, because of its history, which is rather unfortunate with regards to conservation and extinction, but it has great potential to learn new lessons, and it has trained some of the foremost conservationists around the globe about how to restore ecosystems, build them back from the ground up, and ensure that we can continue the restoration of biodiversity globally. And so not only is Durrell and Wildlife Preservation Canada, as well as its associates, based in our respective countries, but really the stronghold of Durrell's vision, as well as the work that goes on in Mauritius, is it has global impacts. Everything in green here shows alumni from different programs, and ever slowly but surely, there's many more people on the ground to help further these conservation actions who have received expert training, often starting their journey in the small island of Mauritius. So without further ado, we have arrived. Welcome to Mauritius. This here is a standard look over one of the high mountainsides and landscapes. And as you begin to look to the lowlands, you can begin to see a lot more of that human footprint. Agriculture and farmland, especially sugarcane, goes from the lowlands to the ocean. But it's these beautiful mountainous and volcanic areas that are now the remaining stronghold of that native forest, and so crucial to the preservation and restoration of wildlife today. So having left Canada around early March and traveled to Mauritius via Paris, France, I found myself in a very different landscape. Goodbye, ice and snow, and hello, sunburns, because my fair skin certainly took some offense to all the sunshine, but soon enough I was out there and immersed in what was absolutely a spectacular landscape, just brimming with life, and a very valuable outdoor laboratory in which to learn. Of course, I was immediately taken by all the reptiles, given my natural affinities, but the bird life began to grip me too. And so did the fascinating natural landscapes that unfolded before me and my colleagues that were enrolled in this educational program. from this paradise flycatcher, I think so aptly named. I felt like I truly had immersed myself in paradise as I began to understand the challenges ahead for the flora and fauna of Mauritius, but I was very eager to learn what was just around the corner in this conservation and training program. So as mentioned, Mauritius is so unique because a lot of the islands, pardon me, plants and animals are found nowhere else. Unfortunately, the plants have in many cases suffered a similar fate to some of pardon me, to some of the very special wildlife, and that is that a lot of species are ranked as a very high conservation concern. And so when it comes to conservation and ensuring the preservation of ecosystems, naturally, a lot of this responsibility falls on plants. Plants are what feed and house animals that rely, and they also support each other. They control climate, they provide shade, and so on. And so plants naturally are the first starting building block to a lot of conservation. And that's where I first began to get really acquainted. Now, of course, on an island that has rich soils that are volcanic and one that's tropical, and also one that has been under the control of a lot of colonial powers up until relatively recent times, not surprising, export agriculture has reigned supreme, and that's especially true for sugarcane, which has found a really large market in South Africa and Europe. So a lot of the challenge of Mauritius today is, not so much active deforestation, but it's reaching a compromise between people's livelihoods, especially as it pertains to agriculture, and restoring natural landscapes and forests. Another major challenge, especially as it concerns the native wildlife, are invasive predators. A lot of predators like mice and rats and pigs or boars are no stranger to islands, having been introduced intentionally or unintentionally by seafarers. Species such as mongoose were, of course, then introduced to control rats and mice, but that never really quite worked. The mongoose much prefer to prey on other things. Present day, Mauritius is a fascinating melting pot of cultures, primarily people of Indian descent as well as East Asian, but also a lot of French or Franco-Mauritian populations. A lot of the present population of Mauritius is Hindu, which have very strong and respectful affinities to monkeys, and so crab-eating macaques at one time were introduced. And although they're cute and seemingly innocent, they prey very heavily on nesting birds and songbirds. Feral dogs and cats are problematic too. And this cute little guy, a tenric, which is a type of hedgehog-like creature from Madagascar, has been introduced. And as cute as they are, they've been implicated in causing major declines in insect diversity. So really the odds are stacked against, with so many problems occurring at once. Where do you start? But the truth is there are a lot of lessons to be learned. Not all non-native species are inherently bad. All these reptiles and amphibians shown here are non-native. This spiny lizard from Sri Lanka, these frogs and toad from mainland Africa, and this large day gecko from Madagascar, although not native, are a little bit more innocuous with respect to the introduced wildlife of Mauritius. So really this conservation training program that I found myself so immersed in is composed of many parts, and these really are like jigsaw puzzles that fit together and are complementary to understanding and actively achieving positive conservation outcomes. That includes an understanding of the biology of small populations. Small populations are vulnerable to further decline. They sort of enter a declining or extinction vortex, and so understanding how they operate is really important. Of course, conservation doesn't exist in a vacuum either. We need to work with local peoples, many of which are immediately reliant on these natural landscapes in order to to thrive. And where people thrive, nature can also thrive too. So understanding how to work to meet local people's needs. In many ways, conservation can be a lot less about biology and a lot more about humanitarianism. So gaining leadership skills, also learning and working with stakeholders that have a vested interest, and of course learning very specific techniques, everything from tree climbing to chopping fruit to make supplemental diets, and understanding the fundamental needs of species, all factored into part of this conservation training. And I was lucky to find myself with lots of young and inspiring people from around the globe. These were all my colleagues that were enrolled in this program, from the UK and the United States to Australia, Mauritius, Madagascar, Austria, and further afield. Lots of students that were very excited to quite literally get their hands wet and feet dirty learning. So as we hop around the relatively small island of Mauritius, I'll highlight sort of key places. And this was really the home base out on the southwestern coast. And this in particular was the home base because it's home to a captive breeding center for a lot of the native wildlife that's being used to help repopulate the landscape. Right outside my bedroom window here is one of the blue-tailed day geckos. So again, leaving Canada in March to arrive on a tropical island was really quite a treat in so many ways. And with a beach just a few steps away, it really afforded an opportunity to begin to familiarize myself with this amazing landscape. Seeing fish out of the water was such a strange one. These little mud skippers here would come out and bask on the rocks along the shoreline and hop back into the water when a threat emerged. And likewise, the gorgeous sea urchins and starfish and coral reefs were a wonderful way to pass the really early morning or evening hours when not out at some of the more remote field stations. The large green area down towards the southwestern part of this map is called the Black River Gorges National Park. And this is where a lot of the remaining intact forest landscape is located. And so it's not surprising then that that is sort of used as the epicenter from which to move outward and continue conservation activities, including forest restoration and the rehabilitation of wildlife populations. Foremost among these projects is a project with the pink pigeon. The pink pigeon's closest ancestors trace to the Nicobar Islands of Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka region. These are fascinating. These are really one of the closest living relatives of the ground-dwelling and flightless dodo bird. The pink pigeons declined by the 1970s to only about 30 wild individuals. They're really a gorgeous bird, about the same size or slightly larger than our local mourning dove, and a very similar coo to boot. And they tend to prefer the high elevation conifer forests of Mauritius. They pair up and they tend to mate for life, but a challenge that they're really facing right now are food shortages, because a lot of the forest landscape is degraded with invasive trees. And because it was subject to such heavy logging in centuries past, a major concern is that there just simply isn't enough food left for a lot of these birds. And so an early and relatively innovative conservation solution was to provide forest feeding stations for these birds. It also conveniently provides a way to monitor populations, because a lot of these birds are subsequently banded. And so much like the banding that occurs here to track bird populations through time, this has afforded a great opportunity. So by providing these birds a reprieve from food shortages, their populations have really taken off. And this is, of course, only a short-term solution, really a band-aid. What's required into the future is the replanting of native vegetation and the maturation and fruiting of the trees that these birds require. So the pink pigeon is still still holds an endangered status, but today There are now several hundred of them, and they're at least self-sustaining and reproducing, such that they don't need a captive breeding program anymore. So the pink pigeon was originally one of the species that Gerald Durrell arrived to Mauritius to work with, having heard at the time that there were only about 30 wild individuals left, and having worked with and raised so many species of songbirds growing up in the UK, he really wanted to take that challenge by the horns and start his captive breeding program with the pink pigeon. And it's thanks to the early efforts in the 1970s that the species is still with us on planet Earth here today. A major component of my time in Mauritius was to learn banding techniques. Although we may not think of it immediately as an important conservation strategy, it is, of course, because it helps us monitor populations. And it also helps us learn a lot about species by looking at individual behaviors and survivals and estimates of population size. And so I was very fortunate to band a new individual to the population, a juvenile pink pigeon that had just fledged its nest, and got to learn quite a few skills in the process, including climbing trees. So all of these were helping to guide my toolkit as a young conservation practitioner. The upland forests where these birds dwell are quite a contrast to the lowlands. I showed you the sunny, beautiful beach photos. The uplands, not surprisingly, at these higher elevations are almost constantly drenched with water, everything being soppy and muddy. And so when you start the day, knee deep and your toes in the salty water of the ocean, you can easily catch a chill and get soaked to the bone up in the uplands. I never really thought that I would develop some skills akin to an arborist while I was there, but sure enough, that's what we did. This was part of a tree climbing module to learn how to safely climb and instruct others how to climb trees to access bird nests. A major challenge that a lot of the pink pigeons, as well as the parakeets, continue to face are non-native predators. And these include things like the crab-eating macaques that will destroy and raid the nests of these endangered, and in some cases critically endangered birds. And so as part of some of the captive breeding initiatives, eggs will be collected from wild birds and incubated in captivity and raised before release. And also by keeping the nests intact but removing the eggs, you can encourage many species of birds to double clutch or re-nest. And so this has allowed populations to increase much more rapidly by encouraging more rapid reproduction. And so tree climbing was a very nerve-wracking experience, but I think one that taught me the value about going outside your comfort zone and seeing where it takes you. But I must say that the views were absolutely spectacular from a height. If not nerve-wracking, then you're certainly rewarded by seeing the landscape from the treetops here in the Gorges National Park. This is another major species and focus of our work in the gorges. This is called the echo parakeet, and it shares a very similar story to the pink pigeon, but it faced perhaps an even greater conservation challenge because it's a highly social bird. And so once populations decline to critically low limits, the sociality of these birds really begins to break down, and they no longer form family units, and that can be extremely problematic for recovery. The echo parakeet today numbers around 400 to 600 individuals in the wild. And once again, like the pink pigeon, has increased from between about 30 to 50 individuals at its lowest point. Today, these species that have so declined face a lot of challenges, the biggest one being what we call genetic bottlenecks or very, very low genetic diversity. What happens is, because they don't have family groups to roam with and socialize with, and not too many other individuals to breed with, sometimes you get interbreeding of families, which lowers genetic diversity and increases the rate at which diseases can be problematic or abnormalities and illness. And that right now is a major challenge for the echo parakeets. they're quite vulnerable to a disease that's been introduced through the captive bird trade and non-native birds. And so captive breeding efforts have to be especially vigilant about trying to outbreed populations, that is, breed individuals that are not related in order to maximize genetic diversity and make sure that their populations remain sustainable well into the future. Now, because a lot of the largest trees had been logged centuries ago out of Mauritius, especially coveted by the British for big ship masts and sails, structures to adhere sails to, the echo parakeets don't have a lot of nesting habitat. Unlike the pink pigeons, which make a bit of a rough nest of a shamble of sticks, really a lot like our mourning doves or the rock doves, pigeons that occupy our urban centers. The echo parakeets rely on tree cavities, and you know that tree cavities typically arise in much older, often storm damaged trees as well. So in the absence of trees that are old and large, the echo parakeets also run up against a shortage of places to reproduce. And so in their place, researchers over the years have developed the perfect nest box that replicates a hollow tree cavity. The extra special thing about this is it has a very deep canister, and that prevents the monkeys, the crab-eating macaques, from being able to stick their arm in and raid the nests. But behind this rubber flap is a small toggle, and it also allows researchers while tree climbing to climb up and check on the nestlings and see how they're progressing, and also access the nestlings in the nest for banding. And that, of course, allows, once again, monitoring of these birds. So these boxes, about 3 feet or a meter tall, get hoisted up when you're climbing the trees and affixed right to the tree. And this is, once again, an innovative tool in the conservationist toolkit to try to help recover these populations in the wild where they belong. And this here is just to show a contrast. Although it looks, of course, like a gorgeous forested landscape, this here is all a species of Asian guava. It's an extremely delicious plant to eat, and no surprise, in the absence of native fruits for a lot of the wildlife to feed on, they feed on this guava, which further spreads it. But the guava is really challenging because it grows quick, it grows dense, but it never gets big enough to be particularly useful for wildlife for areas like nesting. And so it's a bunch of very short, twiggy branches that are very shady, and they shade out the native regeneration of trees. And so there's lots of initiative right now to help clear back this non-native guava and start replanting the native trees and give them a head start on life. The Mauritius kestrel is a really, really special story, and perhaps the hallmark today of Mauritian conservation. The Mauritius kestrel was very close to going the way of the dodo. With only 2 to 4 known individuals left, this species truly came back from the brink of extinction. And this was because of a gentleman named Carl Jones, who was a falconer in the UK. Conservation organizations around the world had given up on the Mauritius kestrel. Even BirdLife International, a leading conservation group, said it's too far gone. It's not worth it. With only, fewer individuals than you can count on your hand left, they were doomed for extinction. There's a lot of questionable ethics about, catching the last remaining individuals from the wild and bringing them into captivity for captive breeding. But that's what Carl Jones got permission to do. He caught the very last kestrels in the wild and also climbed the cliffs in the gorges to collect their final nests. And he raised those birds and released them to the wild. And ever so slowly, their numbers have been creeping up, now numbering several hundred. The Mauritius kestrel truly has been a success story, and one that's built upon the backs of a lot of people and a lot of effort. It's, of course, not just enough to captive breed and release these animals, but the restoration of its forest habitat is crucial, especially because it mostly relies on the small and colorful geckos that dwell in the upland forests. I think this photo here, to me, really, I think encapsulates some of my time in Mauritius, in that I'm just so struck by how spectacular these geckos are. And they're such an integral part of the food chain in Mauritius. As mentioned, you know, these geckos feed the kestrels, but they're also a really important pollinator of native vegetation on the island. And so everything is so interconnected. Of course, these lizards are necessary in order to help restore the forests. Replanting is necessary to help restore the forest, but in turn, the lizards are being kept in check by their main predator, the kestrel. And so I'll just pause on this photo for a second and see if you can count how many geckos are in frame. But I love this photo because, well, you're up in the trees climbing and accessing these bird nests to check on the nestlings and do bird banding a few hundred feet above the ground. It takes you a second to look around, but you really begin to appreciate just how much life there is up in the canopy, mostly life unseen. And so there they are. There are 6 geckos just right in one small frame. Really quite a spectacular sight to see. In fact, across the island of Mauritius, there are 5 native species of day gecko. You know, you might know these from a car insurance commercial. Geico is always trying to sell you the lowest rates on car insurance. But these are an actual species, the ornate day gecko furthest on your left, the aptly named blue-tailed day gecko center. Not surprised, this neon green day gecko. Quite confusingly, the species is sometimes called the night day gecko. And finally, the Gunther's gecko, a very large species on the far right there. Well, we'll head out of the gorges and into the lowlands to a small islet just off the coast called Île aux Aigrettes, meaning quite literally an island of egrets. That's a nature reserve today. So small little islets off the coast of larger islands can be really crucial to conservation because they can be small havens. As mentioned, there aren't a lot of native mammals to islands because they have such a hard time crossing water. You know, we don't do very good if we go for long periods of time without food, and certainly not very well if we only have salt water to drink. And so it's no surprise that naturally a lot of mammals don't occupy remote oceanic islands, and especially predatory mammals. So when we introduce things like mice and rats and mongoose and boar and even deer to islands, they can thrive because now they have abundant vegetation on which to feed, and they have no native predators themselves. So when small offshore islands like Île aux Aigrettes remains predator free, it can be a haven for a lot of the native wildlife. And so it has been. And it's also been a really important model for gauging what conservation and restoration should look like. This quote here from a conservation biologist, I think, captures it really nicely, that our goal of restoration in ecology, whether it be, you know, for instance, Phragmites removal in a wetland in Midland, or the restoration of a whole island in the Indian Ocean, it's not about putting Lego pieces together per se, and it's not reverse engineering a landscape that existed hundreds or thousands of years ago, but it's slowly putting things back piece by piece and trying to let a fragmented ecosystem reconnect and recover over its own natural trajectory. So this is a photo from Île aux Aigrettes looking back to the Mauritian mainland. Île aux Aigrettes is wonderful because in the absence of most colonized predators, it is a natural landscape on which to model other restoration efforts. From this beautiful island hibiscus, lots of natural native species are being grown in small greenhouses to be reintroduced elsewhere. So I learned a lot about plant propagation techniques, something that I was entirely ignorant of up until that point. And it really instilled in me the importance of learning to be a gardener first, when in some ways when you're aiming to do conservation, because of course the animals don't exist without the plants and nor the soil. What also really struck me is how intertwined a lot of the species relationships are. This is a fascinating plant that goes by the common name ratwood. When it's small, the ratwood is sort of a shrubby, stumpy type bush. And as it grows into a long, slender tree. And even the shape of the leaf changes. And one thing that might stand out to you about this photo is that in the young plants, they have this bright red vein down the center. And that bright red vein is meant to discourage herbivores from foraging on the plants. But of course, what large herbivores would have fed on these plants? You know, there aren't deer and there aren't a lot of other large herbivores that we would typically expect. And then whereas these really tall leaves that are above head height don't have that poisonous stem or vein in there whatsoever. Well, what these plants really are is they're a carryover from an ancestor, the giant tortoises that used to occupy Mauritius that are now extinct. Just like the giant tortoises of the Galapagos, the giant tortoises of Mauritius played a really important role before they were over harvested to extinction by sailors. It's these tortoises that were really early grazers and have such an important role in maintaining the dynamics of vegetation, whether it's pruning back low shrubby cover or feeding from taller trees. These tortoises were really an important change maker on the landscape, and they're gone today. Not only that, they're really important for dispersing seeds, you know, being an animal that could feed on large fruits and pass them through their gut, and being relatively slow and bulky. They would roam around the lowlands dispersing seeds and fruits, and of course providing them a big nutritious starting medium in which to grow by laying those seeds, depositing those seeds in big piles of dung. And so with the tortoises gone today, it raises a question about what are we missing? Some of the connections have been broken within this ecosystem. Well, we can't bring those tortoises back from extinction, those native Mauritian species, but we can do, what we can do is introduce what are often called analog species. The Seychelles archipelago, also located in the Indian Ocean, just north of Madagascar, is home to the Aldabra giant tortoises, which have managed to survive human exploitation for centuries. So what conservationists have done on Îlot Regret is to trial a new technique to conservation. Rather than humans having to be the agents of change, which can be expensive, it can also be, of course, not nearly as effective, a small group of these Aldabra tortoises, which are very similar in their ecology as far as we know to the now extinct Mauritian tortoises, were introduced. They're now beginning to breed, and that's being overseen. But these tortoises are fulfilling the ecological roles that were lost when the native tortoises went extinct. And so I was very fortunate to see everything in the tortoise life cycle, from hanky-panky through to egg laying and egg hatching, and even found one small hatchling on the island. So of course, it's not a perfect solution, but these sorts of analog species are a way that conservation might be able to connect a few of those broken chains in the food web and use those to help restore these environments. And indeed, these are giant tortoises. You know, spending time alongside them was a really special thing, to get to watch their behavior and watch them forage. Of course, the dodo as well, you know, much bigger than our modern day wild turkeys, would have also been a major player in transporting fruits and seeds and acting as seed dispersal agents in these lowland ebony forests. But in the dodo's absence today, at the very least, we can hope that the tortoises are helping to fill that role. Not only that, a lot of the native Mauritian people consider a lot of the lizards to be quite emblematic. This here is a species called the Telfair skink. And here are some researchers working with them in a small greenhouse setting where they're being captive bred to help repopulate areas where they've been eliminated from other islands. These small offshore islands too are huge havens for the small songbirds, which on the mainland encounter those problems with the crab-eating macaques, the monkeys, as well as the mongoose and others. This is Mauritian fody, a small and beautiful songbird that happens to live and thrive on Îlot Aigrette. And another critically endangered species here called the olive eye. Of course, we have a familiar cast of characters on the beautiful islands too. There's an ornate day gecko cracking a smile at us. So even on these other offshore islands, we face a small number of challenges. These, for instance, are introduced giant African land snails, which have a hearty appetite for native vegetation. Control efforts are underway to bring down the population of these snails, which greatly impact the efforts to restore the vegetation on the islands. I did a small research project involving these snails, and I can conclude that they are very, very abundant. What's amazing is just the diversity of plant types that you can see across these gradients, from these lowlands and limestone or coral atolls all the way up to the high volcanic summits. You get a huge diversity of different plants. Most notably, this lowland forest is dotted with Mauritian ebony, this beautiful white-barked tree. Although very few ebony trees today are large and mature, they produce a fruit that's highly coveted by a lot of the native wildlife, and major efforts are underway to help restore these native ebony population. It's a really sought after wood even today, and is unfortunately subject to illegal harvest and trade, in large part because it's extremely dense. It's very, very strong. It's very dark. It can be used for carvings, but it's also relatively lightweight and can be made to float easy. So it has a lot of applications in engineering as well. So from the coastal environments up to the coralline habitats and the volcanic atolls, Mauritius is really quite diverse. Now, located about 20 kilometers off the north shore of the mainland of Mauritius lie a series of islands that are especially important for conservation and biodiversity because of their relative remoteness and what they've managed to keep intact, and better yet, what humans have managed to keep off the islands. These islands here are called Round Island and Serpent Island. Round Island, is shown on this map here, is really an old collapsed volcano. That's what accounts for this sort of crescent or half moon shape. It's a volcano that has since gone long since gone dormant and begun to collapse into the sea. Round Island has a really interesting history because no predatory mammals per se were ever introduced, but a lot of grazing mammals were. So the vegetation was really heavily impacted, which caused some trickle-down impacts to the wildlife, but not as severe as you might immediately expect. So today, Round Island is so important and so closely guarded for the sake of conservation because it remains one of the last few vestiges of native forest and vegetation types that exist in Mauritius in terms of minimal impact. It's a really important breeding colony area for seabirds in the Indian Ocean as well. So from the mainland of Mauritius looking north, this here shows Gunner's Coin, an island on the left, and right central in this photo frame is Round Island. The seas are really choppy going out to Round Island, but this location of the Indian Ocean is really key breeding ground, as mentioned, for a lot of seabirds, but also a lot of whales bypass through the area and use it as important breeding and feeding grounds. So the coral reef habitats around Mauritius are really crucial. There's no there's no clear docking point or easy way to make landfall on the island. So in between swells, it's usually hopping on and off boats from the Marine Coast Guard. And as shown on one of those posters a couple slides ago, there's really important biosecurity protocols to keep the island as intact as possible. Going on and off the island requires that all food be washed and inspected to make sure there aren't seeds of non-native plants. Even your excrement from going to the bathroom gets carried off, so that way you don't introduce seeds of plants that shouldn't be there. And likewise, all of your clothing needs to be packed and fumigated beforehand as to not introduce unwanted plants. And once you land on the island, you find yourself clambering over these basalt cliffs, the old remnants of the volcanic heritage. And the one thing that'll really jump out here is there's not much in the way of soil. And this is largely because of the rabbits, the European rabbits, and the goats that were introduced as food for early sailors. Unfortunately, when those herbivorous mammals were introduced, they ate a lot of the native vegetation, and with no roots to hold the soil down, heavy monsoon rains washed it all away. So that has been a major challenge to trying to replant the island. Is no longer is there a lot of nutritious soil for these plants. So this really sculpted landscape is part of an artifact of its volcanic heritage, but also, unfortunately, some of the destruction wrought by the rabbits as well as the goats. These palm trees here, called the blue latan palm, are some of the last remaining individuals in the world, and they are now being propagated by greenhouses around the world to keep the species alive. But they're slowly recovering on this landscape as the soil begins to accumulate. Of course, a really slow process. So once again, some of this really starts with building the ecosystem back from the ground up, including soils, plants, then animals. I was really taken aback by how how dramatic this landscape has been shaped by water, by the severe winds coming off the oceans, and as well its introduction of mammals past. So, early visitors to Round Island wrote lots of really interesting information in their journals. And for instance, in 1845, an author named Lloyd wrote how the ravines were so crowded with palms and areas of the island had deep, rich soil with, quote, the most powerful vegetation. But with nothing to inhibit them or keep them in check, those rabbits and goats rapidly wiped things out. So this is very much a habitat that is in recovery. Many of these palms slowly being restored and regrowing. As you can see from this photo of my shoes and pants here, these are unfortunately seeds of invasive plants that have taken hold and been introduced through time. So there's been a bit of a constant battle these days to try to knock back the non-native vegetation and restore what once was. There's a small solar powered field station and accompanying small greenhouse on the island that provides a refuge from the intense sunlight that bakes down onto the island during the day, and also helps with some of the replanting effort. But one thing, if you've ever traveled to remote islands, you often know that the wildlife is not afraid of you. In fact, it's quite naive that you are even a threat to them whatsoever. And that's especially true of these bulky Telfair skinks. Here they are in the kitchen, getting into mugs and drinking tea, trying to lap up the last of the pot. So it's quite funny when you share your living, your eating, your sleeping, and of course, your day-to-day workspace with these very charismatic and large-bodied lizards. There's one that's helping with the dishes, licking up the little bits of olive oil and so on. So certainly it's not a good thing to feed wildlife, but I guess when they're living everywhere around you, it's also hard to keep them out. After all, we are in their habitat. So Round Island is home to species like the Telfair skink. This here is a beautiful species that lives in the, it's called a Bossier skink, that lives in the splash zone right along the coast and feeds on small marine and terrestrial invertebrates. There's a small species here called the night gecko. You can find clambering around the rocks at night. Of course, these are found nowhere else other than this small round island of measuring only about 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, having been wiped from almost every other site where they occurred in Mauritius because of the introduction of predatory rats and mongoose. And of course, we see our old friend, the spectacular ornate day gecko. And as I mentioned, these geckos play such an important role in maintaining connectivity in these ecosystems. We can even see on this photo of one ear, it has a whole bunch of pollen on its snout. So it has been visiting plants, and it's a really important pollinator, transporting pollen from one plant to another as it licks the sugary nectar from plant to plant. Now, one species some people may or may not be excited to see on Round Island is the Round Island boa. This is only one of 2 snakes that has been known to occur on Mauritius, and the other has not been seen since the early 1980s and is now presumed extinct. That other species, a burrowing boa, probably went extinct because there was not enough soil for it to burrow in. Whereas this species, which tends to dwell in shrubby vegetation and higher in the palms, has managed to survive. These snakes are extremely evolutionarily unique. Researchers who study the evolutionary biology have put them way out on a distant branch of life. And so they are really unique in that regard, and they have a really interesting behavior and morphology. They prey almost exclusively on these lizards, so they have a really unique contraption to their jaw that allows them to feed. But this is the only place where they occur today, once again on tiny Round Island. And what's quite spectacular is when they're young and they're born, they're bright orange. You know, they're only about as thick as a shoelace, but they are brilliant, brilliant orange, and they fade to a brown gray as they age. But we have no idea why they would start their life out looking so bold and then becoming quite drab. But this to me was really an incredible highlight. This is an animal found nowhere else than a 1 by 1 kilometer square in the world. To find one was just a life-changing experience, and to learn more about them and watch their behaviors as well. Round Island is also home to a few of maybe the more creepy, crawly things most people wouldn't necessarily like to conserve, but still very important in their own right. This includes an endemic scorpion, an endemic cockroach, and a very large and somewhat frightening endemic centipede. And as mentioned, the island is a really important home to nesting seabirds. This here is a tropic bird through different stages of life: egg, small tiny fluff ball, and an adult. And the breeding tropic birds were just spectacular to behold. Out in the morning, they would head out in droves to go fishing. They'd come back to visit their nests and feed their nest mates throughout the day. There's also several species of petrel that occur in the Indian Ocean that don't breed anywhere else. So Round Island, Serpent Island are home to several species of petrel and tern, and those are part of an active monitoring program with banding to better understand their populations and how they're doing, and ensure that they have sufficient nesting habitats on the islands. So although this island is small, only about 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, it's extremely steep, and working out there during the day in 40 degrees Celsius heat is really quite wild, like nothing I've ever experienced in my life. From the summit of Round Island, it's completely barren. You can see that a lot of the birds nest in the shadow of the rocks to the fierce winds that whip up. that are going across the open ocean. In this video here, I'm clambering over a bit of the denuded summit and try not to get dizzy here. But there's the volcanic lava that is essentially swallowed up by the ocean. And there are a few other friends here. There's some seabirds soaring. Oh, I think we're about to, look at, there's a giant tortoise we found right at the very peak of the island, lumbering about. You know, there's not much for it to eat, but it's probably just passing by. And right beside that tortoise, oh, there's one of the small skinks, one of the lizards right there too. So really, I found it so breathtaking to be out on this island doing a lot of the plant restoration and learning about these techniques, but being surrounded by these tortoises and of course these lizards galore. What's fascinating about these tortoises too are these are once again the reintroduced or introduced analog species. These are tortoises from the Seychelles that have been brought back to Round Island. And although those on Îlot Egret were used primarily for seed dispersal, those here on Round Island are serving another different and very important purpose. These tortoises are helping to keep invasive weedy plants in check. So these tortoises spend a lot of time roaming about and they graze the non-native vegetation and keep it at bay. And so that helps conservationists and ecologists to plant the native species and help them take hold such that there's not so much competition from the weedy plants. And indeed, research has shown this, that the tortoises are really great at helping to knock back the invasive vegetation, while researchers are working to help restore the native plant communities. And better yet, they also serve as a basking platform for the lizards. So it's pretty cute to watch those large skinks hitch a ride on kind of these mobile solar panels. And here's just a video of that. A lot of the plants in this little cluster, as I would learn, are actually non-native species. And you can see here the tortoises just go to town chomping those down. And that allows researchers to then come along and help replant that area and even temporarily fence it off with some of the native vegetation until it can become established and begin to seed. So the tortoises are really quite the characters to share the island with, but really they're once again a valuable tool, but also valuable members of that ecological community that can help with the restoration efforts. And this here, I'm getting towards the end, but this here strikes me as a really important takeaway message. The large palm tree right in the center of this figure doesn't look like much, but it's called a hurricane palm. This is the very last tree of its species in the wild. Up until the past decade, there were several of these hurricane palms on Mauritius, but the high winds from the island, especially the lack of shelter from other trees, has caused almost all the others to collapse. This is the last of its kind in the wild. Although a lot of greenhouses are now propagating them and there are plans to reintroduce them, this is really the last of its kind. So I got closer to it and I really wanted to see up close and take a moment to appreciate how important it was that this, is the last of a long legacy. And what I was astounded by is, on its trunk was one of these Gunther's geckos, the large day geckos. And down in the dropped leaves below it were many of these skinks running around. And perched around it were several of its seeds, these really interesting large seed pods that are about as big as your thumb. And so it found me really sort of deeply thinking about this might be the last individual, but it's not going down without a fight, still producing seeds that are being used to help propagate it in greenhouses for eventual reintroduction. And how important this single tree was just for many of those lizards that were occupying it and spending time. And not only that lizard, but this too, this is now a stick insect that is only found on Round Island. And some recent studies of the native lizards on the island has shown that this stick insect is a really important component of their diet. And in turn, that stick insect relies on a couple species of palms that grow on the island. And so once again, these ecological connections are so important, but they're also very fragile. And so by protecting the palms and revegetating the island and building up the soil, you can in turn restore these insects, which help feed the lizards, and in some cases will help feed species such as the kestrels. I spent a lot of time studying and watching these stick insects. Maybe not the most interesting thing for somebody to do, but as a naturalist, I quite love them. And I subsequently published a short note about the natural history of these stick insects, hoping that it can propel a little bit more further research and the important role of these insects as building blocks for a much larger intact and functional ecosystem. So going back to the mainland now, you know, we've heard a lot about the sort of lessons I took and the important toolkits from these habitats and what we need as biologists and conservationists and naturalists in order to restore these systems. And these are all lessons and tools that are transferable, whether they're in Mauritius or whether they're in Ontario. But one of the most important lessons that came to me was working with stakeholders and local communities. Now, as a biologist and aspiring conservationist, a lot of my lessons were in wildlife biology. And that's really important. You need to know the fundamentals about species and their biology in order to conserve them. But as I hinted at earlier, you also need to know a lot about people and how to interact with them and how to meet people's needs. The lowlands are not only dominated by sugarcane, but also a lot of orchards, especially citrus and papaya. This here, and another species called jackfruit. This is a papaya plantation. And we can see here a papaya tree with a ripe fruit that has been opened up and torn into. And this, at the crux of this lies a really important issue, and that is one of people's trust in conservation activities and also human-wildlife conflict. Here in North America, we usually think of human-wildlife conflict as being, you know, bears raiding somebody's trash bin or somebody being attacked by a coyote in the suburbs of Toronto. Well, wildlife conflict takes a bit of a different turn, at least in this case, because a lot of people of Mauritius have or take offense to the large native and endemic fruit bats there because of the crop damage that they cause, especially to the fruits. And that extends not only to some other hot commodities. This is the fellow trainee named Jack, standing with a jackfruit, a large and highly nutritious fruit that's grown throughout parts of Asia. Cacao, the sort of precursor to chocolate, is grown in Mauritius, and avocados as well. And so this here is the adorable Mauritian flying fox, a large fruit bat. And as you well know, bats get a bad rap for a lot of things, especially now amid the COVID-19 pandemic. We know a lot about bats as reservoirs for disease, but also they tend to be the scapegoats because people misunderstand them so much. This here, the Mauritian flying fox, is also subject to a lot of research in Mauritius, mostly by outside not-for-profit and conservation groups, in large part because of this perceived human-wildlife conflict. So a lot of farmers had assumed that a lot of that crop damage that we saw with that papaya is being caused by flying foxes. But in fact, it would turn out that a lot of it is being caused by non-native fruit-eating birds that have been introduced. And the way that this came to light is because we were trapping and catching flying foxes and placing small GPS trackers on them and then releasing them. And by releasing these bats and being able to track their movements, it was discovered that, in fact, they don't spend as much time in the orchards damaging fruit as farmers had thought. And in fact, they hadn't, although these bats are being shot in the thousands in order to try to protect fruit crops, that's not actually going to be an effective management tool. It's only going to further imperil and endanger the foxes, while the real culprits were a non-native bird that was introduced. Now, unfortunately, science doesn't always meet with policymakers, and this is a really important lesson in conservation too, and probably one of our biggest frustrations. For instance, shortly after my time there, the Mauritian government announced that it was going to cull 20,000 of these fruit bats. These are bats that are only found in Mauritius and already hold a vulnerable conservation status by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. You know, there was a really big lobby from fruit growers that the bats were the problem, but science has shown us that they are not. And so this is a really important point, that conservation cannot just take place in the realm of science, that there's a huge role for conservation scientists to get out and speak to policymakers so that evidence can inform policy and decision making. And in this case, bats are not the target, or should not be the target, because already they're in trouble, and a directed hunt would possibly put them over the edge. For all the successes that I've outlined, especially with birds and reptiles in Mauritius, there's sort of a new face to a lot of conservation challenges, and that is the marine environment. While I was there, I saw quite a bit of shark harvesting, which was a little bit disheartening. There are local livelihoods that are built on it, and there is the possibility for it to happen in a sustainable way. But it needs to, of course, be informed by science and appropriate decision making. It was also a little bit disheartening to see scenes like this of, people kind of celebrating it or touting wildlife harvest as something to celebrate, I guess, for lack of a better word. Conservation is a lot more than just working with species. It comes down to changing people's attitudes as well. And there's a very big role for communication and effective communication in order to achieve positive conservation outcomes. This was a photograph that was of people, of course, sort of harassing this dead shark. I went up afterwards and took what I thought was maybe a little bit more of a quieter, but also a respectful portrait of what was really looked like a pretty astounding animal, probably lost far too soon. And on this note about the conservation challenges that we face, Mauritius itself, like any location, whether it be Southern Ontario or the Baja Peninsula of California or any other location, threats are not isolated. Climate change is going to affect us all. And in this case, in late July of 2020, a major conservation disaster came from further afield. This was a Japanese tanker that hit a coral reef right outside of southeastern Mauritius. This is right near Île aux Aigrettes, and it spilt absolute tons and tons and tons of raw oil into the water, which coated the beaches. It drowned out several of the coral reefs, and the island is still recovering. Many species of rare and threatened wildlife were evacuated off islands and taken to the captive breeding center for temporary holding. But this has been nothing short of environmental catastrophe, and one that, although it was predictable, was maybe not adequately prepared for. Of course, this was all complicated by pandemic lockdowns too, that response rates were really slow to react to this, which made the damages far worse. And so, I think this really helps to hammer home the point that although we live and we often act local, we need to think very global in a lot of our decisions, that despite what has been decades of conservation work along coastal Mauritius and Île aux Aigrettes as just one example, that can change in an absolute instant with something like this. So conservation challenges are many, and that's why I ultimately titled it Paradise in Limbo, that there have been enormous successes. Those are demonstrated here on a small leaflet from the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. Examples of the Mauritius kestrel, the echo parakeet, and the fruit bats have increased thousands of times what they were just a few decades ago. Approximately 7% of all species that have been recovered off endangered species lists globally have been because of conservation activity in Mauritius. And and islands around the world have huge potential to really do good for conservation. And so I don't mean at all for this to be doom and gloom, because we have the tools now in front of us, and increasingly more and more people are being trained thanks to things like the new NOAA scholarship from Wildlife Preservation Canada. And we've shown that there's a lot of things that can be done both into and external to the environment, such as captive breeding, that can really turn around the fates of species that are otherwise destined for extinction. So, you know, the sun has set on my days in Mauritius, but I have certainly not forgot the lessons learned. And I'm going to be taking a lot of these skills and lessons I've learned as I prepare for the next leg of my journey and just wrapping up my PhD at the University of Toronto. And although I'll very much be continuing my time in Algonquin, it looks like I'll probably be headed back to some tropical islands soon, where I hope to be very much involved in a lot of conservation activities. So I want to thank everybody for your attention this evening. I'm very happy to take any questions, but I'll leave you with this short video of a visit with a giant tortoise on Round Island. One thing that's quite funny is when you spend some time around the tortoises, it turns out that they really like their legs rubbed. So here I am rubbing the leg pocket of the giant tortoise. Sometimes they get little parasites, little ticks inside those leg pockets. And if you help pick them off, like some birds do, they stand up just like this. And they let you scratch them and pick the ticks off. So I'm having a little visit with a tortoise friend here, and I'll leave the presentation at that. Thanks everyone for your attention.
Thanks very much, Patrick. That was amazing. We've got a couple of questions showing up, but again, put your questions in the chat. But let me just press a few more buttons here, just a second. Let me find Patrick again. Patrick, I think you might have to unmute again.
Oh yeah, here I am.
So that was amazing. A part of the world that maybe some of us will never be to, but I think we feel we know a lot about it now, which is great.
Thank you.
I might take the first question or just a comment. You know, you're telling about the situation with the cull of the fruit bats. Yes. It puts me very much in mind of the situation with double-crested cormorants right now. And you know, it has to be based on science, but what the heck do you do when the government authorities just won't listen to the science or even suppress the science? I don't know. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that is such a great question, Ken. Oh, that is and it's a tough one, right? It's very hard to change government opinion, especially when parties abide by ideologies rather than science. And so I think a lot of the big challenge there is to of course get out people to vote on topics that they're very passionate about, be it the environment or otherwise, to try to preempt the election of political leaders who will be favorable to items such as conservation.
It's almost even not so much just the government here. They were acting on recommendations from the hunters and anglers who are not necessarily listening to the science either. So I guess it's people like you just getting out and getting the message out and doing the science and telling people about it. But anyways, we got a few questions on the chat, so let's get to them. Question from Steve Lafore. And again, if anybody wants to raise a hand, which you can do in the bottom, and ask a question in person, feel free to do that. Steve Laforest asked, were those bare hillsides at the beginning the result of deforestation, as well as the rabbits and goats?
Yeah, so that would no doubt be referring to Round Island, and some of the video showed there as we hiked up onto the main crest. That wasn't so much direct deforestation, mainly because it would have been at least this is my understanding, but I don't think it would have been deforestation in the immediate sense, in that what would have mostly grown on Round Island would have been palms. And although there are certain aspects of palms that are desired, their leaves are used for thatch and building, and the palm heart is sometimes consumed. They're not particularly great for building, and also given that how rough the waters are around the edge of Round Island and the absence of a particularly accessible docking site, I don't think it would have been particularly harvested for its palms. But we would have had, going back about a century, there would have been pretty severe degradation following the introduction of the grazing herbivores such as the rabbits and the goats. And so really what happened was a vicious positive feedback cycle, that those herbivores began to degrade the vegetation. That then started soil loss. Heavy winds and heavy rains associated with these oceanic islands would have washed all that into the sea. As trees fell, they probably knocked over other trees, and so on and so forth. So I would say, although not direct deforestation in the sense that humans sought the wood for building or direct use purposes, but no doubt, of course, it's our actions through trickle-down consequences that resulted in widespread deforestation occurring through that loss of soil.
Kate says the giant tortoises don't look tall enough to reach fruit at the top of a tree so as to disperse the seed, but they manage anyways.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So they certainly can't reach to the top of all the trees, but what's amazing are the giant tortoises, of course now extinct in Mauritius, but we can look to the Galapagos for an analog. Some people might be familiar with the fact that the giant tortoises of the Galapagos essentially come in two shapes. One is called a dome back, and so they quite literally look like what most people expect of tortoises. Pardon me, is that the front is quite low, the back is quite low, and they have a domed or a simple humped shell. And those species, as we know them today, for example, in the Galapagos, are mostly grazers, so they feed on ground level vegetation. But in the Galapagos, just like Mauritius as well, prior to extinction, there was also a saddleback morphology or variant. And so these saddlebacks, rather than having simply a domed shell, they also had a major part of the shell at its very front, at the neck, right behind the head, that's elevated. And that allows the long necks of the tortoises to stretch tall. So they tended to browse a lot more on the low-lying tree and shrub vegetation rather than graze the ground. So you'd see essentially a partitioning of the feeding niches. You'd have browsers and you'd have grazers. And there are preserved shells in museums, and there is some fossil evidence that both forms occurred on Mauritius, just as we see today in the Galapagos. So there's convergent evolution. And so, yeah, some of those, browsing tortoises could certainly reach about 5 to 6 feet or so off the ground, which would allow them to forage at least to some of the taller shrubs and many of the young trees.
John Foster, is there any program on Mauritius to completely eliminate the introduced mammals? For example, the monkeys, mongoose, mice, etc.
Yes, that is a major initiative of the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation in collaboration with the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. I was going to talk a little bit about the non-native species trapping and euthanasia that we did, but that's a little sensitive with some crowds, and so I stayed away from that. But there are certain non-native predators that are trapped and rehomed, cats and dogs, for example. Rats and mongoose are euthanized, and there are pretty extensive trapping networks that go across parts of the areas and the islets in order to help protect that. The macaques are a very contentious subject. Historically, they were harvested and captured for the medical research and pharmaceutical research trade. In large part, macaques were highly sought from Mauritius because they don't have a lot of diseases that primates elsewhere carry, mostly because Mauritius is so isolated, and a lot of these diseases, especially mosquito-borne diseases, have never been introduced. So macaques, on one hand, were kept under control for a while because they were being captured and shipped overseas for medical and pharmaceutical research, which has its own ethical conundrum of sorts. That was outlawed some time ago, in part because of ethical and animal welfare concerns. But today, because a very large population of Mauritius are Hindu in their religious practice, and monkeys play a really important part in Hindu culture and are highly respected, it means that the capture, harassment, or killing of monkeys is highly frowned upon. And so this sets up a really big challenge, because once again, this isn't a matter of biology. We know that in order to achieve conservation, those primates should be eliminated because they're huge nest predators, and they readily kill trees and eat all the fruit, so native species can't eat it. But on the other hand, you have a huge human population that would not easily allow for it. And so it's a very delicate dance of the peoples of Mauritius, and I guess what they desire for, as well as the integrity of the natural system. And somewhere you have to find a compromise in that, and there's no easy answer.
Okay, we'd probably take a few more. When we're done with questions, so we hope people will hang around. We're just going to do a little bit of talking about sharing sightings in the immediate local area. So hang in there for that. John Dixon here. Thank you for the connections to the work and legacy of Gerard Durrell, whose early books we enjoyed so very much about 50 years ago. It's terrific to see some of the successes from his initiatives. Have you read all Gerard Durrell's books, Patrick? Or
I have not read them all, but I have read a lot of them. They're wonderful to pick up from secondhand stores if anybody's looking for stories about his adventures. So I very much enjoyed it because he's been so entertaining in his ways of writing. And that's been wonderful. But I'm hoping now that I'm about to finish graduate studies, I'm going to have a little more time on my hands for recreational reading.
Now, your presentation put me in mind of that old song too, though. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Mauritius? Do you find, I mean, all these lessons you've learned in Mauritius, hopefully you're going to apply them here in Ontario or in Canada, but not quite as exotic. Do you enjoy the challenge of working here just as much, or?
Yeah, I certainly do. You're right there. It may not feel as exotic some days, especially right in sort of the dead of winter right now. But I think especially the lessons I took in stakeholder engagement and in working with policymakers, as well as conservation project leadership, have had a lot of applications here. So, I may not be building the same nesting boxes for parakeets or banding pink pigeons, but all the same, I feel like I could tree climb tomorrow if I if I wanted to, just like Mauritius. So you're right, there's a lot of cross-pollination and transfer of skills that way. But next time I get back to a tropical island, maybe I'll wrangle another mongoose, but until then.
But I think there's lots of comments here about what a wonderful presentation it was. Fascinating part of the world that most of us really haven't paid that much attention to. And I think your comments about making sure that you look at things with a global perspective, it helps when you're tackling these local issues as well, to see what's going on in other parts of the world. So thank you very much. And with that, Patrick, you're welcome to hang around if you like, or I might unspotlight you, but we're gonna, if anybody wants to address the meeting with some local sightings, when you look down here on the bottom, I think, where is it? Reactions. Usually you can raise a hand there. And and then I'd see it and turn the floor over to you. But let me spotlight Patrick here. And I'm going to turn it over to Bob. He has some photos he wanted to show. And I might disappear for a bit, Bob. So you take over. See if you can share your screen. Are you unmuted, Bob? Or
I am. I'm here. I'm
Okay,
just
you're
looking
good.
for whatever the hell it is I did with my sightings. There we are. So,
Can you share your screen?
yeah, like you said, got to remember how to do all this. Okay, here we go. Oh no, Zoom quit. Can you see what I've got?
Yeah, but click on one photo and open it large. We can see the photos, but I think if you can click on one and click on the bald eagle. Right now,
Zoom can be.
right now we're seeing all of them. And the white-crowned sparrow was highlighted. We lost you, I think.
How about that? Am I back?
I'm going to pin you again. Okay. And try sharing the screen again.
This does not seem to be working. Okay.
Yeah, it's up now. It's the white-crowned sparrow.
Okay, well, oops, I didn't mean to do that. White-crowned sparrow, nothing spectacular, just not supposed to be here at this time of year. Seen this one several times along in St. Marie Park behind the houses. I have not seen it for about 2 or 3 weeks, but one of our members, our vice president, has seen it fairly recently, so it's still hanging around. A lot of these photos are they're not rare birds or they're not spectacular photos, but they're just seasonally unusual. Like this one, a rusty blackbird. I took this photo, 2 or 3 days ago at McKinnon Road, part of the Menacing Wetlands complex. It was keeping company with a couple of cowbirds and a red-winged blackbird, all of whom should not have been here. They should have all gone south, but they didn't, and they're still here. So it makes for some interesting viewing if you're a birder. These are tiny marsh escapees. They are the ones that escaped the annual pheasant hunt. They're introduced, of course, but they're very colorful on a snowy winter day, and that's the only reason I included them. Red-shouldered hawk, again, another bird that's not supposed to be here at this time. This was over around the Washago area. That's been seen several times, and apparently it's made a habit of sticking around the winter. This bird, or one that looked very much like it, was here last winter as well. This is one of those famous pine grosbeak. This one was up at Sawlog Bay. You can see just a bit of the pink coming in. So I think this is a young male that's gradually getting its red coloring. Well, everybody knows what that is. That's in the woods right behind our house. So they come and visit our feeders fairly regularly, but he's picking away at an ash tree, and as everybody probably knows by now, we've got literally hundreds of thousands of dead ash trees. So there's an abundance of food for woodpeckers, and they don't really seem to feel the need to come to our suet feeders as much as they have in the past. This was right in our own backyard. Maybe 2 or 3 days ago. Sue says to me, "There's a hawk in the backyard." And I came running, and of course, it's really not a hawk. It's a falcon. That's a lovely adult merlin, just a gorgeous little bird. This is another bird that should have gone south. This is also at McKinnon Road. It's a real collection of rarities. And I think where we're going on our outing on Sunday, you're going to see this similar situation where there's still birds hanging around the Collingwood Harbor that should have left for south, but are still around. Bluebirds. This time of year, bluebird is unheard of. If you can see here, there's 4 of them. We actually seen 5. Talking with Ken, how many did you say you saw, Ken? 7, did you say?
Me, that's counted at least 7, yeah.
That's just remarkable at this time of year to have bluebirds, especially bluebirds in these numbers hanging around. There's another look at one. This one is a Cooper's hawk. This was at St. Marie Park again. We spend a lot of time walking there in the winter because we see more birds there than pretty much anywhere else. And so many people visit that the trails are usually quite passable despite how much snow we might get. And lots of these guys around. Bohemian waxwings. It's a real treat. We saw approximately 40 today, and you never know where they're going to pop up, but it's always nice to see them. There's another one. I'm really struck by the patterning on the wings. Way more colorful than its cousin, the cedar waxwing. There's a bald eagle. This was on my birthday, so it was a birthday treat for me. This is at the mouth of the Wye River. Because of our unusually warm winter, we've had open water quite frequently in Midland Bay, and that allowed some of the ducks to linger this year. This one was hunting for ducks, and you see he was quite successful. He's picked up a goldeneye. He flew around and around the flocks in the water till he drove a couple of them to flight. With a couple of really powerful beats of his wing, he was on top of this goldeneye and knocked it out of the air down to the ice where he pounced on it. I didn't catch the moment of the kill, but here he is carrying it off to find a more private dining room. And I think that's all of my photos for now. So somehow I got to figure out how to stop sharing screen.
You did it.
Oops. Did I?
Yeah, you stopped sharing your screen. Congratulations.
And, thank you.
I'm going to try to share mine.
Achievement.
While we were busy, Patrick fielded a late question about are there bees in Mauritius? There's a small number of native bee species, and he's given an iNaturalist guide for. As for pollination, the relatively low bee and pollinating insect diversity is offset by the abundant pollinating lizards. Let me see. I'm going to unpin Bob. And let's see if I can share my screen. Some of my photos kind of duplicate Bob's, but that's the way it goes this time of year. So we'll just give you an idea of what is out there if you go birding. We're talking about taking this club trip to Collingwood on Sunday. And this is one of the stars over at the Collingwood Harbor right now, a little American coot that's decided to spend the winter there. When you go on fall migration, sometimes you'll see 60 or 70 coots in the harbor. Right now we're down to 1, but he's mixing in there with the mallards. Coots are a little more challenged when it comes to swimming because they're not actually a duck. They're more like a rail. So they don't have webbed feet like a duck. If you saw their feet, they look like a rail's kind of long, skinny toes. So that's why they kind of bob their head, because they have to work a little harder when they swim. This is another one of the stars over at Collingwood Harbor. There was a couple of the northern pintails, one of our most elegant looking ducks. Hopefully we see them on Sunday. And there's lots of other interesting things there that hopefully if we get a good day, we'll see. Right now, if you get out looking for birds, keep an eye out for these big flocks of Bohemian waxwings that are flying all over Midland. I was over in Smith's Camp, saw a big flock of about 120 there. They've showed up at the Y Marsh. They move around quite a bit, often looking for fruiting trees, and a beautiful bird to see. They do look similar to the cedar waxwing, and there haven't been a lot of reports of cedar waxwings in our area right now, but they may start showing up. But the easiest way to tell them apart, I find, is when you're looking up at them from the bottom, from underneath the tree. A cedar waxwing would be all kind of that tan color here, whereas the Bohemian waxwing is red under the tail. That is a giveaway right away. These were those same bluebirds that are hanging around McKinnon Road. Nice to see some of them braving the winter temperatures. Another bluebird down in McKinnon. And this has been a good year for us to see evening grosbeaks in our area, a bird that we don't get to see every winter, but occasionally they do make inroads down here. And there's been some fairly large flocks coming to people's feeders. This is a friend of ours who has, will sometimes have 70, 80, 90 evening grosbeaks coming to her feeders, eating around house and home. And this was kind of a special bird that you may have read about in the paper that came to our local. This is not a canary, an escaped canary, as so many people tried to convince us. This is an evening grosbeak who's lost the melanin, the black that normally covers all those yellow feathers. So it shows up as all yellow. And it's interesting, once we kind of publicized the presence of this bird here locally, people started telling me there was somebody over in the Bruce Peninsula that saw this bird at the beginning of November. I have a friend in Penetang that had it at herd feeders at the end of November, and then it showed up at feeders in Elmville, in Hillsdale. And right now, we're pretty sure it's the same bird as being seen over by Lake Dalrymple. So moving around with some of the big flocks of evening grosbeaks. And one of our members, Peter, has this unusual starling showing up at his feeders. And again, it's an example of leucism, a lack of melanism in some of the feathers, making for a rather spectacular looking starling. This is a little duck that's been overwintering in Penetang Harbor, and it was up there about a week ago. Things might have started to freeze. It might have moved back into Copeland Creek, but there's actually been a pair of these green-winged teals hanging around Penetang Bay. And as long as there's some open water in that kind of western corner of the bay, you might still be able to see them there hanging out with the mallards and the geese. One of our members, Jerry Van Gelderen, this is the second winter he's had a northern flicker hanging around his feeders in Penetanguishene. Last year was the first year we were able to count northern flickers on our Christmas bird count. And thanks to Jerry, and I think we had one other seen on this year's Christmas bird count as well. And the pine grosbeaks they've only started to come down in the last 2 or 3 weeks to our area. And right now we see mostly the, this is kind of a female type bird, although and I think this might be an immature male as well. There's been a few of the bright red males being shown, but hopefully we'll see more of them as the winter comes along. So that was my little, let's see if I can stop screen sharing here. My little contribution. Anybody else have anything to add before we say goodnight? Okay, and another question from Patrick. I think he's still here. And this is, he's asking about the possible de-extinction of the dodo. They're talking about bringing back mammoths and all sorts of things. I'm not sure if it's what people think about that as a way of restoring.
Yeah, John, thank you for your question. I was typing up what was amounting to a bit of a long-winded response, so it's probably just much better to reply here. I haven't heard about any specific initiatives for de-extinction with the dodo, but there is preserved tissue. You know, for instance, there's a desiccated head and neck and skull and many leg bone samples that have been recovered. So there's possibly viable genetic samples that could be used for further consideration. But I am sort of left to wonder about what the closest surrogate species would be used, either, you know, that would have to lend an egg or some level of genetic material, perhaps as part of a blending of genetics or so on. I know the closest living relative is the Nicobar pigeon from the Nicobar islands off of India and kind of Sri Lanka way, but their biology is really different. I mean, they're a flighted bird. Body wise, they're much smaller, so maybe they wouldn't be able to support an egg that might grow an embryonic dodo, assuming that somebody could ever get the genetics that far. So yeah, I'm sure you and many others are probably no stranger to the controversy that is is de-extinction. You know, of course, another technological fix to a problem, and a slippery slope if we say, we can always bring it back later. Let's destroy the habitat now. So that carries its own suite of complications. But yeah, it would be interesting to know what would be used as a surrogate, given that the closest living relative has a pretty different biology. And so it's hard to know whether it would ever be a viable option, but it's a great question and an excellent thought experiment.
Yeah, they keep saying that we're kind of only a couple of years away from possibly bringing back the mammoth, which is hard to believe, but has anything, and you know, some people feel there's some merit to reintroducing a large species like that to some of its the tundra environment. But has anything smaller been de-extincted or brought back? Is there?
No, not to my knowledge. I mean, aside from work that's being done in medicine to grow certain organ tissues or develop kind of more domestic species like pig and cattle in such a way. Yeah, I'm not aware of any successful projects that have truly de-extincted anything that's like Pleistocene caliber that would go back many thousands of years. You know, at least more recent extinctions like the Tasmanian tiger or thylacine is conceivably realistic, as is something like the dodo as well, because there's at least viable genetic information from each of those. But yeah, I don't know, and I think personally, I think it's really bad if somebody does manage to achieve it, only because then it would give us a technology-based out where people would think, right, why should we bother with habitat preservation and keeping populations intact now when we can hopefully reverse engineer extinction later? But that that might be the passenger pigeon. That's a great point, John. Yeah, the passenger pigeon. Right, that would be one to bring back. Would that be fascinating? And certainly no shortage of specimens in museum holdings that could provide the genetic basis to try to bring it back. That's a really great example.
I'm just reading a book says, you know, that we wiped out the passenger pigeon, which was a very important part of our environment. We're getting perilously close to wiping out a lot of the shorebirds all around the world, and we don't seem to be as worried about that as maybe bringing something back like that. Anyways, a great night, great presentation. Anybody has anything else to say it now, or I'm going to close the meeting.
I just wanted to thank Patrick for a marvelous presentation, and I guess my only comment is I don't know how you keep from getting depressed by dealing with the effects of our abuse of the planet. I find it very depressing personally, and you very positive and upbeat. So good for you. I wish I was.
Thank you, Bob. I think it's just because I have a lot of turtles in my life. Turtles and salamanders will keep a person excited.
Well, good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, good night, everyone. I'm going to say good night, and we'll close the meeting in a few minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.